The Table Layout Panel control is a new control that allows you to dynamically add other controls to your forms without having to specify an absolute top and left position. Instead, you can decide to specify which column and/or row the new control should be created in at runtime. The table's columns and rows grow dynamically to accommodate more controls than originally anticipated. And the table can be set to scroll automatically so that the user can see the new controls even if they fall off of the viewable area. You might be wondering why you would ever want to dynamically add controls to your forms at runtime instead of just adding them at design time using the designer surface. There's actually a couple of reasons. For example, you might want to allow users to add functionality to your application, but you don't want to share your source code. You can allow them to configure additional fields of information that will be stored in a database, for example, but you'll take care of the complexity of displaying the controls on the form. Your users won't have to be programmers in order to add custom fields to the application. The Table Layout panel accommodates some sophisticated layout schemes. If you don't need this complexity, you could consider using the Flow Layout panel control, which adds new controls relative to the existing controls within the panel. Now, before we start the demonstration that I've already created, let's go ahead and show how to add a Table Layout panel control to a form. So to do this, I'm going to add a new form to the application, and then we're going to go to the toolbox down to the containers grouping, and we'll select the Table Layout panel and just drag it and drop it into place, and we'll move it over here. Using the Quick Task window, we can add a new column, so now it has 3 columns. We can add a new row, so now you can see it adds a 3rd row. We can remove the last column, and we can remove the last row. Also, we can edit columns and rows using this little link here at the bottom, which will open up the column and row styles dialog box. And so here, for example, we are currently looking at columns. We can see the 2 columns that have been defined. We can change the information about these columns using the size type, for example. We can set the percentage to, I don't know, 70 or so, and then change the other column to 30 if we want to. Or we can change it to an absolute value, so we can change from 20 pixels to 50 pixels or so. Or we can just select an auto size. We can add and delete columns and insert new columns in between existing columns. The same is true for rows. We can choose the height of the given rows, or we can choose to auto size. Add, delete, and insert rows as well. Once we've configured the Table Layout panel, then we can start adding controls into it, and what we can do is just drag and drop controls into any of the cells. Notice that when I drop a button, for example, into one of the cells, it immediately snaps into place in the upper left-hand corner. We can also change which cell a given control appears in through its properties. Whenever you add a control to the Table Layout panel, it will be given some additional properties that will allow you to adjust some of the unique properties of its parent container. For example, we can change the column and the row by going to the cell property and changing, for example, the column to the first column by setting this from 1 to 0 and then hitting the Enter key on the keyboard. And notice that it moved it from the second column to the first column. We can do the same thing with the row by changing that as well. We can also change the column span by changing from 1 column to 2 columns, so that now this control can be stretched across multiple columns. We could also do this with a row span property as well and stretch it across multiple rows if we wanted to. Notice that if we were to take our button and remove it from the panel, that it loses those extended properties. We no longer have a cell property for our button. So now that you've seen the basic setup, let's take a look at the application that I created to demonstrate some more of the functionality, at least from a programmatic perspective. We have Table Layout Panel CS. which has a simple table layout panel control already defined with 3 rows and 2 columns. And notice that we already have a button control with its call span property set to 2. So this is very similar to what you might do when you're building web pages, for example, and working with tables. You can choose a specific cell to extend and span across multiple columns, or take a particular cell and span it across multiple rows. Except in this case, you're doing it with the actual control that will sit within the given cell of the table layout panel. Now, most of the functionality of this application is contained within the source code, and it will really make a lot more sense if we take a look at the source code in our main_load event, our form load. So what we've done here is created 3 buttons dynamically, creating first an instance of our button, giving it a name and text, and then adding it to the controls collection of the table layout panel. So here we're adding a first button, and we have a 0, 0. This indicates the column and the row that we want to add it to. And this is just one of the versions of the add method that are available. We can set, for example, the column and the row as properties of the new instance of our button as well, if we prefer to do it that way, or a number of different versions of this add method. And we do the same basic steps for the second and the third button as well. Notice that we've also decided to set the border style for our panel so that we can see the outline of that panel, and we set that to inset, which is one of the enumerated values from the table layout panel cell border style enumeration. So let's go ahead and run our application and see where it put our controls relative to where we've specified. Notice here that with the third button as well, we didn't specify a location. So let's see what happens here. So the first button lands in column 0, row 0, which is the first cell, I guess you would say, as we look at our table. The next button, the second button, lands in the 0 column and the first row, or row 1, which is actually the second row. Now, what will happen is the table layout panel will try to place the third button as close to the top as it can, and close to the left as it can. So it places the third button here in the second column of the first row. Let's change our example around a little bit and try to specify that we want this to appear in the first column and in row with an index of 2, which would be the third row. So let's run the application now. And notice what it has done. It's added a row to our panel layout control because our button 1 was already occupying the row that the third button was trying to occupy. So there's definitely some behavior that you'll need to become accustomed to, and kind of the precedence of order of which of the controls will take precedence based on how we lay them out. Now let's do this. Let's uncomment out some code that we have here. Whoops, so that we can adjust the column and row styles. Here we're going to try to adjust the column style of column 0 with an index of 0, so the first column, setting its width to 400. Similarly, we're going to adjust the size type from fixed to auto size. And then finally, we'll set the first row, so our row styles collection dealing with our first row with an index of 0, and we'll set its height to 300. So let's see what that does now to our example. Notice here that our first row was expanded. However, it was at the expense of the second row, which got kind of smushed together. Additionally, because we had the auto size turned on, notice that the first column is only wide enough to accommodate our buttons, and the second column is made wider. So we can change at runtime the style of the columns and the rows by using the column styles and the row styles collections, specifying the index of the column or the row that we want to work with, and then accessing the properties of the column or the row with the dot notation as we do with anything else that we work with within the .NET framework. Let's go ahead and comment this out and try another example. This time we're going to add some more rows, or rather some more controls. And let's walk through what we've done here. First of all, we set the grow style to our layout panel to add rows. So here we're specifying that when in doubt, whenever the table layout panel needs to grow, that we want to grow it by adding rows, not columns. Now we begin to add the 4th, 5th, 6th, and 7th buttons, and notice that we're simply just adding them. We're not telling the panel layout control where we want them. We'll let it just randomly place the controls based on where existing controls are configured to display and what else is available. Finally, we'll set the auto scroll property equal to true. Let's go ahead and run this. Okay, so we have the first, second, and third button like we're accustomed to. We've already looked at how our button 1, our button that is of a column span of 2, occupies that 4th row. And then the 4th and the 5th buttons will appear as close to the top as possible, and 6th and 7th appear near the bottom. Now this wasn't quite the behavior that we may have expected. We might have expected the 6th button to appear over here in this particular cell, and the 7th to then appear over here on the left-hand side. And that simply didn't happen. But we do have the ability to allow this to grow at based on its own internal rules, or we can control how they're added by specifying the column and the row that we want to use. And frankly, it would probably make more sense to use it that way. In most cases, we'll probably have 2 or 3 columns, maybe with a label on the left-hand side, and then the control itself, maybe like a text box or whatever the case might be, on the right-hand side. But using the table layout panel, we have some fidelity of control over how we want to place our controls on a dynamically expanding form of new controls as they're added to our form, when we can't foresee at design time how many controls we're actually going to need.